The fourth objection against the covenants is that they improperly blend civil and religious matters. In reply, we may content ourselves with referring to what we before said in support of the position that such deeds may lawfully embrace both descriptions of things. In addition, we may remark that the cause in which the Covenanters were embarked, the enemies by whom they were opposed, and the dangers with which they were surrounded, were of both kinds. That from Macree's Short View, etc. They were necessitated, therefore, to frame their measures with a view to the removal of evils and the accomplishment of ends both of a religious and a political character. They had to have respect at once to the interests of the Church and those of the civil community. Prelacy appeared in their eyes not simply as an unscriptural system of ecclesiastical polity to be encountered with weapons drawn from the Bible, but as a gigantic hierarchy armed round on all sides by secular power and political influence. The bishops were not merely insolent, quote, lords over God's heritage, unquote, but the submissive tools of worldly statesmen and an arbitrary monarch. Ecclesiastical grievances were seen springing from political abuses, and political grievances again from ecclesiastical abuses. Religion and civil policy could not, then at least, be separated. Even had such a separation been in itself desirable, the circumstances of the times rendered it impossible. This, we presume, accounts in the most satisfactory manner for the combination of political and ecclesiastical matters which has been given a complexion to the public deeds of the Reformers, and been made the ground of so much complaint against their measures, a combination which, for the reasons assigned, was not only perfectly natural, but altogether unavoidable, in a struggle in which the civil and religious interests of the country were inseparably blended. Quote, all the noted covenants and leagues, says Dr. Macree, in which the interests of the Reformation throughout Europe were so deeply concerned, were of a mixed kind. They contained engagements on the part of the confederates to defend one another in the profession of the Protestant religion, or in throwing off the authority of Rome and correcting abuses which were partly religious and partly political. They were entered into by public men in their several secular capacities as well as religious, and even by corporate bodies. Such was the League of Smalkalde, of the Swiss Covenanters, and of the evangelical body in Germany, and the Covenanters of Protestant provinces and towns in France and in the Netherlands. Such also were the national covenants in Britain. The Solemn League was a complex deed, both in its form and in its matter. It was not only a covenant with God, but also between people and people for reciprocal benefit and on certain terms. Security was stipulated on the one part and aid on the other, in the prosecution of its great objects. Religion formed the great and principal matter of it, but the promoting of this was not its sole object. National reformation and uniformity were combined with national liberty, safety, peace, loyalty, and law. It was adapted to the dangerous, distressed, and deplorable estate of the three kingdoms, as well as of the churches in them. It was not, therefore, a mere church covenant, but was framed, sworn, enjoined, and promoted by the public authorities of both church and state. Some condemn this as an improper blending of heterogeneous matter, and think that our ancestors ought to have framed two separate covenants, one in defense of their civil liberties, and another for religious purposes. If those who express this opinion will make the trial, I apprehend they will find it in articles, and these not the least important, which they will be unable to dispose of without making a third covenant to be taken by all, or else adding them to each of the two as equally pertaining to both. In either way, they will inevitably plunge into what they call the old error of blending. There were peculiar duties which those in civil and even military stations owned, respecting the articles which were of a religious complexion, and vice versa. There were duties which ministers of the gospel and church courts owed, respecting those which were civil, political, or military. The truth is, there is no article in the Solemn League that is either purely civil or purely religious. The civil things in it were connected with the religious, and the religious bore a relation to the national state and policy at that time. An accurate acquaintance with the circumstances in which our ancestors were placed will, I presume, fully justify the measure they adopted, and show that they acted with the great wisdom when they embodied in one common engagement to God, and among themselves, those things which Providence had joined together, and thus secured the vigorous and combined exertions of the friends of religion and liberty in a cause that was common to both. Nor did this imply any undue blending of things which, though connected, are in their nature distinct, nor any confounding of the constitution and powers of church and state, or the respective offices and duties of the covenanters. It may just as well be said, to make use of a familiar comparison, that when a mason and carpenter enter into a joint contract to finish a building, there is a confusion of trades, and that the one is to labor in the occupation of the other instead of doing his own work and providing what is common to both." Unquote. This from his Sermons on Unity, Appendix, pages 160 through 162. We may notice further the charge of rashness and precipitation, which has been preferred against the documents in question. But this object is still more unfortunate than any of the others. It is true, the circumstances of the times called for prompt and decisive measures. Tardy procedure must have proven injurious, if not fatal, by giving advantage to the enemies of truth and good order. A habit of acting with energy was consequently formed, accompanied with a quickness of perception and a readiness to determine, of which the men of a more tranquil and languid age can form but an inadequate idea. Still, the history of both the public covenants already given is sufficient to show that they were the products of mature deliberation, and that due care was taken to prevent their being entered into without consideration. The ablest men in the kingdom were employed to frame the deeds. They were afterwards revised clause by clause, and the matter of them deeply and solemnly weighed. Here a footnote. As, for example, the Solemn League, which was successively submitted to the General Assembly, the Convention of Estates, and the Westminster Divines, and which was freely discussed article by article, and grave deliberation upon by all these venerable bodies. No pains were spared to prepare the people for swearing and subscribing them with understanding and judgment. The documents themselves were printed and circulated, with explanations and directions. Ministers were instructed to read and explain them to the people, as well to exhort them on the point of duty. Explanatory addresses on the subject were delivered by laymen as well as divines, and even noblemen and members of Parliament were not ashamed to give speeches on occasion of the taking of the covenants. Nothing could exceed the affecting solemnity with which the national covenant was renewed in 1638, and this itself should be deemed enough to wipe off the aspersion under consideration. The powerful and pertinent prayer of Henderson, the impressive speech of Loudon, the reading of the document, quote, out of a fair parchment, unquote, by Johnston, the death-like silence of the people that ensued, the sensation produced when the venerable Earl of Sutherland stepped forward and appended his name first to the memorable deed, the rapidity with which it afterwards circulated round the church to receive subscriptions, the eagerness with which they crowded round it for the same purpose, when it was spread out like a prophet's roll on a flat gravestone in the churchyard. The mingled expressions of joy and sorrow that rose from the crowd, joy at what the Lord had wrought, sorrow for personal and national sins, the shouts, the groans, the tears which succeeded, and above all, the forest of right hands simultaneously uplifted in awful appeal to the Searcher of hearts. These all bespeak deliberation as well as determination. Well might Henderson explain, quote, "This was the day of the Lord's power, wherein he saw his people most willingly offer themselves in multitudes like the dewdrops of the morning. The great day of Israel, wherein the arm of the Lord was revealed, the day of the Redeemer's strength, on which the princes of the people assembled to swear allegiance to the King of Kings. Great, great was the day of Jezreel." Unquote. The noble instruments of which we are speaking, and which we have felt called upon thus to defend from the aspersions of their enemies, were, let me now remark, imperiously called for by the circumstances of the times. If public covenants can ever be deemed seasonable, those in question cannot be said to be ill-timed. If times of distress and deliverance from danger and success, as we have seen, call to this duty, then must the deeds in question stand acquitted from all charge of unseasonableness. Indeed, for the reformers to have neglected to take this method of fortifying themselves against ensnaring temptations, of securing steadfastness, of advancing reformation, and of expressing gratitude to Almighty God, would have argued anything but an enlightened understanding of the times and what Israel ought to do.